Picture a completely desolate landscape. We're talking a massive, foggy graveyard of old gods and shattered cathedrals. And walking through this heavy mist is a figure we only know as the Shadow. This entity has basically made a career out of trailing behind the great prophet of the heights, Zarathustra, literally mimicking his stride through every single peak and valley. You see, the Shadow is the one who has done the really heavy work of the hammer here. It has violently overthrown old values until the heavens themselves are just completely hollowed out. But here's the catch. The Shadow is totally exhausted. It's a really poignant, almost tragic symbol of the spiritual vacuum left in the wake of its own massive destruction. So welcome to this explainer. Today we're stepping right into the laboratory of nothingness to explore a grim, dark fable that pushes philosophy and philology to its absolute limits. Okay, let's dive into this because we are kicking things off with one of the absolute most chilling propositions in modern philosophy. Enter Baron von Meets. He's this sort of cosmic scribe who's been quietly observing our exhausted Shadow. Now, Zarathustra, the prophet, has been urgently warning the Shadow not to succumb to some new faith. He fearfully whispers about this narrow prison that might end up trapping its restless soul. But then, the Baron steps out from the mist, and he brings something much darker, and honestly, much more seductive. He doesn't offer a prison at all. Instead, he asks a terrifying question that hits right at the core of the Shadow's struggle, and he offers a very elegant, albeit permanent, finality. He asks, what happens when the friction of existence is finally reduced to zero? It's a huge question. The Baron observes that the Shadow is completely blind to the future, just desperately searching for a cure to what he calls the tragedy of change. Because life, with all of its wild unpredictability, creates immense friction. It's tiring. So the Baron's ultimate proposition is to just completely eliminate that friction. But at what cost? To really get what's at stake here, we have to look at the ultimate choice facing our ultimate wanderer. On one hand, you have Zarathustra's path. This is the path of terrifying, wide-open creative freedom. It demands the messy pulse of being, that constant, exhausting, relentless innovation of the living. It's asking the Shadow to somehow transcend its limitations and forge a completely new era. But then, standing in stark contrast, you have Baron von Nichta's path, the Creed of Negation. The Baron is offering a trade. Give up that vital blood and the heavy burden of feeling, and in exchange, you get sterile safety. He calls it stabilization. It's literally a terrifying choice between the painful, messy effort of actually living or the comfortable, quiet freeze of absolute zero. To truly understand how any being could willingly choose the Baron's path, we're going to break this down and trace the Shadow's tragic descent using the classic Fichtean dialectic: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So let's trace this journey step by step. Stage 1. The hammer's echo. This is our thesis, the rejection of vitality. Imagine our Shadow standing triumphantly on top of the ruins of those old cathedrals, its hands literally stained with the dust of shattered idols. In this thesis stage, the Shadow has achieved a total, complete rejection of vitality for the old systems. It fully committed to the path of the destroyer. And honestly, at this specific point, the Shadow was actually the closest it had ever been to the truth of the heights. The logic it's following is that by unmasking all the lies of the past, by destroying everything old, the Wanderer achieves absolute autonomy and finally finds its own true substance. But here's the problem. Destruction all by itself doesn't actually create a self, does it? Which leads us perfectly into stage 2, the shivering void. This is our antithesis, the psychic anchor of disgust. Now, what's really interesting about this is how quickly things turn. Because once the sun of those old gods finally sets, the Shadow looks down and suddenly realizes it has no body of its own to cast. It destroyed everything, right? But it built absolutely nothing in its place. So it finds itself totally captured by a nihilism so profound and so deep that it's left shivering in a world where nothing holds any truth. And guys, it's such a striking parallel to the modern societal burnout we see today, that feeling of being completely exhausted by the void of meaning. The Shadow discovers that without old values to blindly follow, and without the internal strength to forge new ones, it's really just a great absence. So the absolutely crucial point here is what happens to the Shadow while it's stuck in this void. It develops what the text calls the psychic anchor of disgust. The Shadow just starts to wallow in its own emptiness. It becomes totally paralyzed by this deep fear that any new belief it adopts will just end up being another narrow prison.
Because it's so incredibly disgusted by the present and so terrified of being trapped by new values, it becomes completely unable to carry the weight of real freedom. It literally cannot move forward into the light of the future. It is just stuck.
And that brings us right to the climax of the dialectic, the parable of the smiling corpse. This is our synthesis, the dark apotheosis.
So Zarathustra is urgently telling the shadow, you have to create new values. Push through the disgust. But the Baron steps from the mist, casually holding the void ledger. He offers the shadow a dark synthesis, an apotheosis. He basically tells the shadow, hey, you don't need to create, and you don't need to shiver in the cold anymore. You can be saved. But, and this is a massive but, salvation under the Creed of Negation means achieving perfect purity by ceasing to live entirely. It means transforming into a smiling corpse in a laboratory of nothingness. And the tragic part? The shadow gives up the struggle. It decides that ceasing to exist is somehow better than enduring the pain of the void.
By embracing the Baron, the shadow loses every ounce of capacity to create and innovate. It is entirely stripped of its vital blood, reduced down until it becomes nothing more than a windowless record. A monument of static regret, just locked away in a sterile, unchanging ledger where the murder of the future is permanently codified. A completed calculation. The friction is finally zero. The messy struggle is totally over. The shadow is perfectly, beautifully, eternally dead. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, a reducible equation, the mathematics of death. To truly wrap our heads around the bizarre appeal of this dark apotheosis, we have to look at how Baron von Nix actually views human life. Spoiler alert, he doesn't see souls. He sees reducible equations. He looks at what he calls the messy pulse of being, vital blood, the incredibly heavy burden of feeling, dirt, hunger, all our chaotic politics. He sees kings totally paralyzed by nostalgia. He sees the shadow paralyzed by nothingness. And he views all of it as just a wildly inefficient mathematical equation. So his solution? The void ledger. He systematically replaces vital blood with perfect data. He swaps out the burden of feeling for sterile safety, and he replaces chaotic politics with stabilization. The Creed of Negation is literally the systematic, calculated elimination of living friction. And this is exactly how the Baron describes his ultimate higher man. He says it's a being that possesses perfect purity only because it has finally and most beautifully ceased to truly live. The shadow is his most exquisite specimen for a reason. It had already done all the heavy lifting of the void by destroying the old world. The Baron just had to finish the math. Because the pursuit of stabilization demands the ultimate, final sacrifice, our very capacity to innovate, to change, and to be human. And so, this incredibly grim fable leaves us holding up a mirror to our own modern condition. When the old structures inevitably fall and that shivering void of nihilism starts to creep in, what do we actually do with the sheer exhaustion of simply existing? Because the Baron's laboratory of nothingness is always out there, waiting in the mist, offering the ultimate easy cure for the tragedy of change. It forces every single one of us to ask ourselves, when you are faced with the terrifying heavy burden of real freedom, will you carry the messy pulse of being, or will you surrender to the sterile safety of absolute zero? Keep exploring, keep questioning everything, and I'll see you in the next explainer.